They taught you Shakespeare like he was untouchable. A pale face, a stiff collar, a marble bust sitting quietly at the center of English history. Everything about that image feels settled, finished, beyond question. And that's usually the first warning sign, because the stories history presents as perfectly complete are often the ones edited the most carefully. So instead of starting with an argument, start with a pause. No drama, no wild claims, just pressure on the details everyone learned to ignore. Real questions, the quiet kind. The kind scholars mention in private but rarely print in bold, because challenging national icons has consequences, not loud consequences, quiet ones. Career stall, funding disappears, doors close without explanation. So serious researchers learn to whisper instead of shout. They leave clues in footnotes, careful wording, half-finished conclusions, and buried inside those quiet academic shadows is a possibility most classrooms never touch. What if William Shakespeare was not who you were told he was? Hold that thought. Notice the reaction in your own mind. Curiosity for some, immediate rejection for others, maybe even laughter. That emotional split matters more than it seems, because when a historical question triggers emotion before evidence, it usually means identity is involved, and identity is where power hides. Now let's be precise. This isn't about replacing one myth with another. It's about asking whether the image of Shakespeare was shaped long after the man himself was gone. Because controlling the past isn't only about facts, it's about narrative, and whoever controls narrative controls memory. Start with the official version. A man from Stratford-upon-Avon. Modest education. No university training. No confirmed travel across Europe. Very little surviving documentation. Yet somehow this same man writes the most intellectually layered plays in the English language. Royal court politics, Italian city geography, legal systems, philosophy, foreign customs, aristocratic psychology, all emerging from a background with almost no paper trail connecting him to that knowledge. Is it impossible? No, but historians have admitted for centuries that it is unusual, unusually silent, unusually convenient, unusually clean, and clean stories in messy centuries should always raise suspicion. So scholars began asking careful questions. Maybe William Shakespeare was a pen name. Maybe the real author needed protection, distance, disguise. That theory alone isn't new. It's more than 200 years old. Discussed in universities, printed in academic debates, not fringe, just uncomfortable. Because once you allow the possibility of a hidden identity, a deeper question appears. Who would need to hide in Elizabethan England? Think about the world he lived in. Rigid class hierarchy, religious surveillance, political censorship, and clear racial boundaries shaping social life. If the true writer didn't match the identity society expected a literary genius to have, publishing under another name wouldn't be strange. It would be survival. And this is exactly where the public conversation usually stops, right at the edge of discomfort. But history does not end where comfort begins, because records from Shakespeare's lifetime reveal something rarely emphasized in school books. England in the 1500s was not isolated. It was connected, global, complicated. African diplomats visited the royal court. Black musicians performed in London streets. Moorish residents lived, worked, married, and appeared in parish records that still exist today. Not imagination, documentation, which forces one simple truth into the light. Black presence in Shakespeare's England was real, visible, recorded, undeniable, and whenever presence is real, erasure becomes possible. Because history is not only written, it is revised. Paintings get softened. Descriptions get translated differently. Words like black, Moor, and dark shift meaning across centuries. By the time textbooks arrive, ambiguity disappears. Certainty replaces it. And certainty is often where power feels safest. So ask a careful question. If later generations wanted England's greatest literary genius to represent a specific identity, how difficult would it be to reshape the memory? Not very. All it requires is time, control of education, and confidence that no one will re-examine the evidence closely. But evidence has a strange habit of surviving in portraits, in letters, in overlooked descriptions, in contradictions too small to notice, until someone lines them up together. And when contradictions begin to stack, the clean story starts to fracture. Now stay precise. We are not claiming instant proof. Real historical shifts never begin with certainty. They begin with patterns, questions, pressure applied to assumptions everyone stopped checking. Because the deeper issue here isn't just Shakespeare, it's authorship, credit, visibility. Who gets remembered as genius and who gets written out of the frame? If the most celebrated writer in English history carried an identity later generations tried to hide, that wouldn't just change literature, it would expose something far more unsettling about how power edits memory itself. And systems built on certain stories defend those stories fiercely. So moving forward isn't about belief, it's about evidence, documents, portraits, language, historical context, and the long trail of scholars who quietly noticed something didn't fit. Because once you truly question the identity of Shakespeare, a far more dangerous question follows immediately behind it. If history could reshape the face of its greatest writer, what else has been carefully rewritten before you ever opened a book? The moment you even suggest that history might be incomplete, something predictable happens. People don't argue with evidence first, they argue with emotion. Because this isn't just about a writer from the 1500s, it's about ownership, of culture, of genius, of the very foundation of English identity. Shakespeare isn't treated like a man, he's treated like a monument, and monuments are protected. So before we go any further, slow the story down and look at something simple that most classrooms rush past: the portraits. Not the famous textbook engraving everyone recognizes, the other ones, the earlier ones, the versions that rarely make it onto classroom walls, because portrait history is rarely neutral. Painters didn't just capture faces, they captured politics. And in Elizabethan England, appearance mattered deeply. Skin tone, hair texture, facial structure, all of it carried social meaning, which makes one quiet historical detail extremely important. Many early descriptions of people connected to Shakespeare's world use words like dark, swarthy, black-haired, of Moorish appearance. Now pause there. Those words don't prove identity by themselves, but they do something just as powerful. They open the door. Because once language introduces ambiguity, certainty disappears, and that's where historians begin to get nervous. Not because the idea is impossible, but because the implications are enormous. If England's greatest literary voice carried visible African or Moorish ancestry, even partially, then the cultural story told for centuries shifts overnight, not gently, completely. And history has shown us something again and again. When a truth threatens power, power rarely debates it openly. It reframes it, softens it, moves it quietly to the margins until people forget the question was ever asked. This is where Shakespeare's mysterious biography starts to matter more than his poetry, because for someone so famous, his life is strangely silent. No personal letters in his own hand, no manuscripts of the plays, no detailed records of education, no clear explanation for his sudden literary brilliance. Just fragments, legal documents, business transactions, a will that lists furniture but barely mentions books. For the most celebrated writer in the English language, that absence is deafening, and silence in historical records is never random. It usually means one of two things. Either the documents were never created, or they were not preserved on purpose. Both possibilities raise uncomfortable questions, and uncomfortable questions are where real history begins. Now look at the plays themselves, because writers always leave fingerprints, not literal ones, cultural ones, language choices, character focus, emotional knowledge, the worlds they understand from the inside. And Shakespeare's works return to one theme again and again: outsiders, Moors, foreigners, displaced princes, people navigating societies that watch them with suspicion. Not once, repeatedly. Most famous of all, of course, is Othello, a black Moorish general, powerful, respected, yet constantly forced to defend his humanity in a white European world. That emotional precision inside Othello feels intimate, personal, almost autobiographical in places. Not proof, but pattern. And patterns matter because writers can imagine many things, but the emotions they portray most vividly are usually the ones they understand deeply. So scholars started asking a quiet question centuries ago. How did a man from a small English town write with such layered understanding about racial tension, displacement, and outsider psychology? Again, not impossible, but unusual. And history is built on examining the unusual. Now step back and widen the lens. During the late 1500s, England wasn't isolated from Africa. It was trading, negotiating, interacting diplomatically with North African kingdoms. Black Africans lived in London, worked in royal courts, appeared in baptism records, were visible enough that Queen Elizabeth herself issued policies about their presence. This is documented reality, not theory. So the idea that someone of African descent could exist within England's cultural world, even within artistic circles, is not far-fetched. It's historically plausible. And plausibility is dangerous to fixed narratives, because once something becomes plausible, it can no longer be dismissed with laughter. It must be examined carefully, quietly, sometimes reluctantly. And this is exactly what certain scholars have done for generations behind academic doors. Not shouting, not making headlines, just following evidence wherever it leads. Some questioned authorship entirely, suggesting Shakespeare was a front for hidden writers who needed anonymity. Others looked specifically at racial identity, noticing how later portraits and descriptions seemed altered, Europeanized, smoothed into something more politically comfortable for future centuries. Because remember, the British Empire would eventually rise on ideas of racial hierarchy and cultural superiority, and empires need symbols that support their story. A visibly non-white literary genius at the center of English culture would complicate that story dramatically. So ask yourself something simple. If future generations wanted Shakespeare to embody a specific image of English greatness, would they preserve ambiguity or quietly erase it? History gives us that answer over and over. Erasure rarely announces itself. It happens gradually, brushstroke by brushstroke. edition by edition, until the original complexity disappears. And once disappearance feels normal, questioning it feels rebellious. Which brings us to the deeper issue hiding underneath this entire mystery. This isn't just about whether Shakespeare was black, it's about something far bigger. Who gets credit for shaping civilization's greatest art? Because if the foundation of English literature rests on a story that was simplified, or reshaped, or partially hidden, then the consequences reach far beyond one man. They reach into education, identity, power, memory itself. And once you realize memory can be edited, a new question appears, one far more unsettling than the first. If the world's most famous writer could be rewritten over centuries, how many other black figures were erased completely before history even learned their names? Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Not emotional, not dramatic, just factual in a way history usually avoids. Because once you start questioning Shakespeare's identity, you're forced to confront something deeper than portraits, deeper than missing documents, deeper than academic debates. You're forced to confront how history is manufactured, not discovered, manufactured, carefully, slowly, by the people who benefit most from the final version. And that sounds extreme, until you remember something simple. Every empire edits its past. Rome did it, France did it, Britain definitely did it, America still does it, because controlling the past is the easiest way to control the future. If people believe genius only comes from one place, they stop looking anywhere else. And that's where Shakespeare stops being just a writer and becomes a symbol, the symbol of English brilliance, European cultural superiority, the intellectual foundation of the Western canon. Remove certainty from that symbol, and the whole psychological structure starts to shake. Not collapse, just shake enough to make institutions nervous. Now pay attention to timing. The clearest, most standardized image of Shakespeare, the pale face, high forehead, thin mustache, doesn't solidify until long after his death. During the exact centuries when Britain is expanding globally, colonizing continents, building racial hierarchies to justify domination. That timing matters, because imagery is never innocent during empire building. It's strategic. Heroes are redesigned to match the story power wants to tell, and anything that complicates that story gets softened or removed. Again, this isn't conspiracy language. It's documented historical behavior. Egyptian pharaohs were repainted lighter in European art. Roman emperors were sculpted to look flawless. Biblical figures were given European features in Renaissance paintings. So the real question isn't, would history alter Shakespeare's image? The real question is, why wouldn't it? Especially if ambiguity existed to begin with. And remember, ambiguity absolutely existed. Conflicting portraits, sparse documentation, descriptions open to interpretation. A biography filled with silence instead of detail. That combination creates the perfect environment for later generations to reshape memory without resistance. Because people rarely defend what they never clearly saw. Now step into something even more revealing. The language of the plays, not just the themes, the sensory detail, textures of skin, references to darkness and beauty intertwine. Metaphors that treat blackness not as absence, but as presence. Complex, layered, emotionally charged. That matters, because writers don't just describe the world, they reveal the lens through which they see it. And Shakespeare's lens is far more intimate with racial tension than the standard biography explains. Again, not proof, but pattern. And patterns create pressure, enough pressure, eventually, to force new questions into the open, which is exactly what began happening over the last 2 centuries, quietly at first. Writers, historians, thinkers, noticing inconsistencies. Some suggested Shakespeare wasn't a single man at all. Others suspected hidden aristocratic authors, and a smaller, more controversial group asked something different. What if the erasure wasn't about class, but about race? That question rarely made headlines, but it never disappeared either, because evidence, once noticed, has a habit of surviving in the margins, and margins are where dangerous truths wait patiently for the right generation to look again. Now zoom out even further. This conversation isn't emerging randomly today. It's happening in a specific historical moment, a moment where archives are digitized, global scholarship is connected, and voices once excluded from academia can finally examine the past for themselves. That shift alone changes everything, because when new eyes read old history, they see details previous generations ignored. Not because they're smarter, because they're less invested in protecting the old story. And that brings us to the quiet tension underneath this entire subject. If Shakespeare's identity were ever proven to be more complex than textbooks claim, partially African, Moorish, or racially ambiguous, the discovery wouldn't just rewrite literature. It would expose something psychological about Western civilization itself. That genius was never as racially exclusive as history pretended. That brilliance has always crossed borders, always mixed, always resisted neat categories. And that realization is powerful, not because it changes the past, but because it changes how people see themselves now, which is exactly why debates like this are never really about history. They're about identity in the present. Who belongs at the center of culture? Who gets remembered as foundational? Who is allowed to represent greatness? And when those boundaries shift, society feels it immediately, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with resistance, almost always with emotion, because truth doesn't just inform, it rearranges. So here we stand at a crossroads in the story. No final proof yet, no dramatic revelation, just a growing weight of questions that refuse to disappear. Questions about portraits, about missing records, about racial presence in Elizabethan England, about emotional knowledge inside the plays themselves. Individually, each detail feels small. Together, they start to form a shadow, and shadows only appear when something solid blocks the light, which leads to the next unavoidable question, the one historians rarely ask out loud. If the evidence continues to point toward a hidden or altered identity, what else inside Shakespeare's life was carefully rearranged before history ever reached your classroom? Now the story turns from possibility to pattern, because one strange detail can be ignored, two can be debated, but when the same kind of inconsistency keeps showing up from different directions, history stops looking accidental. It starts looking edited, and Shakespeare's life is full of edits. Start with something scholars quietly admit but rarely emphasize. For the most influential writer in the English language, we know almost nothing personal about him. No surviving letters written in his own voice. No manuscripts of the plays, no journals, no records describing how he learned the languages, politics, and court behavior he wrote about so precisely. Just legal paperwork, property deals, a will listing beds, cups, and furniture, but barely mentioning books. That silence is not normal. Even minor writers from the same era left more personal traces. Yet Shakespeare, The greatest of them all exists mostly as an outline, and outlines are easy to fill in later with whatever story feels most convenient. Now add another layer. During the centuries after his death, the biography of Shakespeare becomes cleaner, not clearer, fewer contradictions, more certainty, stronger national pride attached to his image. That direction matters, because real historical research usually does the opposite. The deeper scholars dig, the messier the story becomes, unless someone is polishing it. And polishing only happens when the final image is politically useful. By the 1700s and 1800s, Britain isn't just a country anymore. It's an empire spreading language, culture, and power across continents. An empire teaching the world that English civilization represents the peak of human achievement. And at the center of that cultural claim stands one perfect symbol: William Shakespeare. Universal genius, purely English, untouchable. You can feel how important that image becomes, not just artistically, psychologically. Because empires don't just conquer land, they conquer imagination. They decide what greatness looks like, who represents intelligence, which faces become timeless. So imagine for a moment that the real Shakespeare complicated that image. Not entirely different, not dramatically foreign, just not perfectly aligned with the racial hierarchy the empire was building. Would historians celebrate that complexity or quietly smooth it away? History answers that question again and again. Complexity disappears. Certainty replaces it, and future generations inherit the simplified version as unquestioned truth. Now return to the plays themselves, because this is where the emotional evidence grows louder. Think about how often Shakespeare writes about disguise, hidden identities, mistaken names, characters moving through society unseen for who they truly are. It happens constantly. Not once, not twice, across multiple works. That obsession with concealed identity feels personal, almost like a writer thinking through his own condition on the page. Again, pause before jumping to conclusions. We're not claiming autobiography. We're noticing repetition. And repetition inside art usually points to something real in the artist's world. Now consider the emotional intelligence inside characters who exist outside power. Foreigners navigating suspicion. Outsiders measuring every word. People aware that one wrong move could change how society sees them forever. That level of psychological detail doesn't come from distance. It comes from familiarity. From living close enough to tension to understand its rhythm. Which brings us back to the central discomfort scholars rarely discuss openly. Shakespeare writes racial and outsider experience with unusual intimacy for someone supposedly untouched by it. Not impossible, just unusual. And unusual details are where hidden truths like to hide. Now widen the lens again. Across history, many influential black or racially mixed figures have been reclassified after death. Paintings lightened, features softened, ancestry rewritten in polite language, not always through conspiracy, often through something quieter. Cultural preference. People reshape the past to resemble the present they want. And over generations, that reshaping stops feeling like change. It starts feeling like fact. So when modern audiences hear a question like, was Shakespeare black? The reaction isn't just intellectual, it's protective. Because if the answer were even partially yes, if ambiguity alone were confirmed, then one of the strongest symbols of European cultural purity would suddenly look shared. And shared symbols are harder to control, which explains why this conversation has lived in whispers for so long, not fully rejected, not fully explored, just kept safely at the edge of mainstream history. But edges don't stay quiet forever. Every generation reopens questions the previous one tried to settle. And this generation has something earlier scholars didn't: access, digital archives, global collaboration. Voices once excluded from historical debate now able to read the same documents and ask their own questions. That shift alone changes the future of history, because once curiosity spreads beyond institutions, control over narrative weakens. And when narrative weakens, truth has room to breathe again. So here we are, still no final verdict, still no single document solving the mystery, just a growing accumulation of tension, missing records, altered portraits, emotional fingerprints in the writing, an empire with reason to simplify the story, and centuries of quiet scholarly discomfort. Individually, each detail feels uncertain. Together, they feel intentional. And intentional history is the most dangerous kind to uncover, because it forces one question that echoes far beyond Shakespeare himself. If the world's most celebrated literary genius could be quietly reshaped to fit a preferred image, how many other black minds built the foundations of civilization, only to be edited out before history learned how to see them? Here's where the conversation shifts from theory to stakes, because up to this point, the question has sounded historical, academic, almost distant. Was Shakespeare black? Was his image altered? Were records simplified? Interesting questions, but still questions. Now ask something sharper. Why would it matter so much if it were true? Not emotionally, politically, because history only hides things that threaten power. And Shakespeare is not just literature, he is infrastructure, the English language curriculum across the world, university traditions, cultural authority, the intellectual crown jewel of Western civilization. Remove certainty from Shakespeare's identity, and you don't just change a biography, you shake an entire cultural hierarchy, and hierarchies fight hardest when their foundation is touched. Think about the timing again. The British Empire rises. Racial categories harden. Scientific racism appears, claiming Europeans sit at the top of human intelligence. At that exact historical moment, England's greatest writer becomes more visually European, more symbolically pure, more useful to empire. Coincidence is possible, but history teaches us to examine who benefits from coincidence, because when power gains stability from a narrative, that narrative rarely remains accidental. Now step into education. For centuries, Shakespeare is taught not just as a writer, but as the peak of human expression. Students memorize him, quote him, treat him as unreachable genius. And the image attached to that genius quietly reinforces a message. This is what brilliance looks like. This is where civilization culminates. This is the cultural center of the world. Messages don't have to be spoken to shape belief. They only need repetition. Generation after generation seeing the same face connected to the same idea of greatness. That repetition becomes psychological architecture. And psychological architecture is extremely difficult to dismantle, which explains the intensity around this subject. Because questioning Shakespeare's identity isn't just revisiting history. It's disturbing a mental foundation people didn't even realize they were standing on. And when foundations shake, defensiveness appears immediately. Not always loudly, sometimes politely, academically, dismissively, but the emotional reaction is real. You can feel it in how quickly the conversation gets labeled fringe, impossible, nonsense, before evidence is even discussed. That reaction itself is revealing, because strong emotions around historical questions usually signal hidden importance. Nobody gets angry about details that don't matter, so the resistance tells us something quietly powerful. This question touches something deeper than literature. It touches ownership of genius, and ownership of genius has always been political. Now widen the lens beyond Shakespeare. Across the African diaspora, stories repeat with eerie similarity. Inventors forgotten, scholars uncredited, artists reclassified, contributions absorbed into dominant culture without acknowledgement, not always through conspiracy, often through something softer: silence, selective memory, educational omission. Over time, omission feels natural, and natural feels true, until someone looks again. That pattern doesn't prove Shakespeare was black, but it proves something equally important: erasure is historically normal. And once you accept that erasure happens, the question stops sounding outrageous. It starts sounding responsible. Responsible to investigate, responsible to verify, responsible to ask what previous generations avoided, because truth doesn't become less true just because it's uncomfortable. And comfort has never been history's priority. Power has. Now consider one final psychological layer. If evidence someday confirmed that Shakespeare's identity was racially mixed, Moorish, or African connected in ways long minimized, the impact wouldn't be anger alone. It would also be liberation. Liberation from narrow definitions of brilliance. Liberation from the myth that civilization flows in one direction. Liberation from centuries of quiet intellectual exclusion. That's why this question feels so charged, because it isn't only about the past, it's about possibility in the present. Who belongs in the story of genius? Who has always belonged? And who was taught to doubt it? And when doubt disappears, confidence grows in places history once kept silent. Which is why conversations like this never stay academic for long. They become cultural, psychological, even spiritual, because reclaiming truth, or even the possibility of truth, changes how people see themselves. And self-perception is the most powerful force in history. Empires know that. Education systems know that. Narratives are built around that. Control the story, and you influence the future. So now we stand at the edge of something bigger than Shakespeare himself. We're no longer just asking, was he black? We're asking something far more dangerous. What happens to the world's understanding of civilization if the face at the center of its greatest literature was never as simple as history claimed? Because if that door opens, even slightly, it won't stop at Shakespeare. It will force a re-examination of art, science, philosophy, religion, every field where black presence was minimized to protect a cleaner narrative. And once re-examination begins, history can never return to comfortable silence again. Which leads to the next unavoidable question. The one institutions quietly fear most. If Shakespeare's story was simplified to protect a cultural illusion, what else inside Western history is still waiting for the truth to be spoken out loud? At this point, the real tension isn't just about Shakespeare, it's about credibility. Because whenever a hidden history question begins gaining attention, the same defense appears almost instantly. Where is the proof? It sounds reasonable, scientific, fair. But here's the quiet trick inside that question. History doesn't always erase truth by destroying evidence. Sometimes it erases truth by controlling what counts as evidence. And that difference changes everything, because if the standard for proof is set high enough to ignore portraits, language patterns, missing records, political context, and centuries of scholarly doubt, then nothing uncomfortable will ever qualify as real. Not because it's false, because the rules were designed to keep it invisible. This has happened before, many times. Ancient African civilizations dismissed for centuries until archaeology forced acknowledgement. Black scientists ignored until rediscovered in archives. Entire cultures labeled myth until physical evidence made denial impossible. The pattern repeats so often it stops feeling accidental. First comes dismissal, then ridicule, then quiet investigation, then reluctant acceptance, usually generations later, which means the real question isn't, is there proof right now? The real question is, what kind of proof would people even allow themselves to see? Because belief is rarely about evidence alone. It's about comfort, and comfort protects familiar stories. Now return to Shakespeare's racial language, one of the most revealing clues hiding in plain sight. Not just Othello, look deeper. Across multiple plays, darkness is described with unusual complexity, sometimes feared, sometimes desired, sometimes powerful, sometimes beautiful. Not a single flat stereotype, a spectrum. That emotional nuance matters, because writers tend to simplify what they don't understand and complicate what they know intimately. Shakespeare complicates race again and again, which forces scholars into an uncomfortable corner. Either he possessed an unusually empathetic imagination far beyond his cultural environment, or he was closer to that experience than the official biography suggests. Both are possible, but only one explanation keeps the traditional narrative perfectly intact, and history has a habit of choosing the explanation that causes the least disruption. Now look at England itself during Shakespeare's lifetime. We're often shown a white, isolated island, culturally sealed, racially uniform, but historical records tell a different story. African servants in noble households, black musicians in royal entertainment, Moorish diplomats negotiating with the crown, interracial marriages documented in church registers, not myths, documents. England was already more diverse than later centuries preferred to remember, which raises a subtle but explosive possibility. If black presence in Elizabethan England was real, why does popular memory erase it so completely? Because forgetting diversity makes national identity feel cleaner, simpler, easier to control, and controlled memory is the foundation of cultural power. Now connect that to Shakespeare, a diverse England, a mysterious writer, ambiguous portraits, emotionally intimate racial themes, centuries of image refinement during empire building. Individually, each detail feels uncertain. Together they start forming something harder to ignore. Direction, not random confusion. Movement toward a cleaner story. And whenever history moves consistently in one direction, someone is usually guiding it, quietly, patiently, across generations. But here's where the story becomes truly dangerous, because the biggest threat isn't proving Shakespeare was black. The biggest threat is proving history can be rewritten successfully. If that becomes undeniable, every official narrative suddenly looks negotiable, and institutions built on unquestioned stories cannot survive widespread doubt. So resistance isn't really about Shakespeare. It's about stability, stability of culture, stability of hierarchy, stability of belief. Because once people realize the past is editable, they begin asking new questions everywhere else. Education, religion, politics, identity. And questions are far more powerful than answers. Empires collapse slowly under questions, which explains why debates like this feel so charged. They aren't academic arguments, they're pressure points. Pressure on who defines civilization, pressure on who represents genius, pressure on who history chooses to remember, and pressure, once applied long enough, always reveals hidden fractures. So now the mystery deepens. We've moved beyond portraits, beyond missing documents, beyond emotional language in the plays. We're staring directly at the machinery of memory itself, how stories are shaped, protected, repeated until they feel eternal. But eternity is fragile. All it takes is one overlooked truth to crack a perfect narrative open. And when that crack appears, light starts reaching places darkness protected for centuries. Which brings us to the next, even more unsettling layer of this investigation. Not just who Shakespeare was, but who had the power to decide what the world would believe about him. Because if identity can be edited at the highest level of culture, what else inside global history has been quietly rewritten while the world was taught not to look too closely? Now we arrive at the part of the story most people never hear, not because it's secret, because it's inconvenient. Up to this point, we've followed a trail of questions: ambiguous portraits, missing records, emotional fingerprints in the plays, a diverse Elizabethan England later remembered as uniform, an empire with clear reasons to simplify its greatest symbol. Individually, each detail can be explained away. Together, they form pressure, and pressure forces history to reveal something deeper than facts: motive. Because whenever a narrative changes across time, the most important question is never what changed, it's who benefited. So ask it directly. Who benefits from Shakespeare being unquestionably white, perfectly English, and culturally untouchable? The answer is larger than Britain, larger than literature. It reaches into the architecture of Western identity itself. For centuries, European dominance wasn't justified only through weapons or wealth. It was justified through culture, art, philosophy, science, language. A story was told again and again. Civilization flows outward from Europe. Brilliance originates there. The rest of the world receives it. That story required symbols, visible proof, untouchable examples. And Shakespeare became the crown jewel. Not just a writer, evidence. Evidence that European genius stood alone at the summit of human expression. Now imagine that symbol becoming complicated, not erased, just shared. Shared ancestry, shared cultural influence, shared humanity beyond neat racial borders. The psychological impact would be enormous, because superiority narratives depend on purity, clear lines, clean categories. Blur those lines, and the hierarchy weakens, not violently, quietly. And quiet weakness is the one thing empires fear most. This is why debates about identity are never neutral. They're structural. They determine who feels central and who feels peripheral inside the story of civilization. So when someone asks, was Shakespeare black? The emotional reaction isn't just about evidence. It's about belonging. Who belongs at the center of genius? Who belongs in textbooks? Who belongs in the imagination of the world? And for centuries, that center was carefully guarded, not always consciously, often through tradition, education, repetition, the same portraits, the same biography, the same certainty passed down until questioning it felt almost disrespectful. But respect for truth has never required silence, and silence is where hidden histories survive. Now consider something even more revealing: the timing of rediscovery. Questions about Shakespeare's identity didn't appear randomly. They surfaced during moments when marginalized voices began re-examining the past for themselves. The 1800s, the Harlem Renaissance, modern post-colonial scholarship. Each era brought the same quiet realization. History written without you rarely tells your full story. So scholars looked again, not to replace truth with fantasy, but to test whether the old certainty could withstand new eyes. Sometimes it did, sometimes it cracked, and Shakespeare's story never felt completely stable. Too many gaps, too much polish, too much emotional depth in places the biography couldn't explain. Not proof, but tension. And tension in history is like tension in music. It demands resolution. Which brings us to the question hiding underneath everything. What if the real issue isn't whether Shakespeare was black, but whether history allowed itself to see the full truth at all? Because denial doesn't always look like rejection. Sometimes it looks like confidence, absolute confidence, unquestioned certainty. A story so smooth no one thinks to examine the seams, but seams always exist. And once you start pulling at one thread, others begin to loosen. Shakespeare leads to empire. Empire leads to racial hierarchy. Hierarchy leads to erased contributions across continents. Suddenly the mystery isn't literary anymore. It's global. Who built science? Who shaped philosophy? Who influenced religion, mathematics, art, governance? And how many of those names were softened, translated, or removed to maintain a cleaner narrative of Western rise? That's the deeper fear behind this conversation. Not embarrassment, not controversy, recalibration. Because if civilization was always more interconnected than history admitted, then the myth of isolated European brilliance dissolves. And myths, once dissolved, cannot be rebuilt the same way again. This is why hidden history conversations feel so powerful. They don't just add information, they rearrange perspective, and perspective determines possibility. If genius has always been shared, then the future belongs to everyone, not just those history once centered. That realization alone can shift confidence across generations, which is why these questions matter even without final proof, because asking them breaks something subtle but strong, the illusion that history is finished. History is never finished. It is revised every time someone brave enough looks again. And now the story moves toward its most delicate territory. Not speculation, not emotion. Evidence that survived despite centuries of silence. Because the closer we look at Shakespeare's world, the real people around him, the overlooked records, the fragments scholars once dismissed, the more one unsettling possibility begins to emerge. Maybe the question was never impossible. Maybe it was simply ignored long enough to feel unthinkable. And if that's true, then the next discovery won't just change Shakespeare's story. It will force us to confront something far more unsettling. How much of what we call history is actually memory carefully edited to protect power? Now we step into the most fragile part of the conversation. Not the loudest, not the most dramatic, but the most revealing. Because once you move past emotion, past symbolism, past empire and identity, you arrive at the place historians care about most. Primary traces. The small details left behind by real lives. Records no one expected future generations to question. Fragments too ordinary to fake convincingly centuries later. And this is where the Shakespeare mystery becomes less philosophical and more unsettlingly practical. Start with something simple. Elizabethan England kept records, church baptisms, marriages, deaths. household employment, court payments, travel permissions, paper trails mattered, especially for people connected to power or culture. Yet when researchers search for direct personal evidence of Shakespeare's education, travel, and intellectual formation, the trail thins almost immediately. Not disappears, but weakens, enough to raise eyebrows, not enough to close the case, which is exactly the kind of ambiguity that allows later generations to shape interpretation quietly. Now compare that silence with the extraordinary knowledge inside the plays, detailed Italian city layouts, legal terminology used with precision, court etiquette described from the inside, foreign customs rendered naturally, not awkwardly. These aren't surface details, they feel lived. And that contradiction, limited biography, expansive knowledge, has bothered scholars for centuries. Some solved it with alternative authorship theories, hidden nobles, secret scholars, collaborative writing circles, all attempts to explain the same core tension. How did this man know so much? But notice something important. Most of those theories try to preserve a familiar social image: educated, elite, European, because shifting class feels safer than shifting race. Class adjustments rearrange biography. Race adjustments rearrange civilization's self-image, and self-image is fiercely protected. Now look again at racial presence in England during Shakespeare's lifetime, not as background detail, but as living context. Black Africans documented in London parishes, servants in aristocratic households, musicians in royal courts, diplomatic visitors from North Africa negotiating directly with the crown. These individuals weren't invisible, they were recorded, which means interracial contact, cultural exchange, and racial complexity already existed inside the society that produced Shakespeare's work. That fact alone transforms the question, because it removes the argument that black presence was impossible. What remains is subtler. Was it overlooked or later minimized? History has answered that question before. Entire populations fade from textbooks without ever leaving the archives, not destroyed, just ignored. And ignored evidence can remain hidden for centuries until curiosity returns. Now shift to something even more delicate: the emotional architecture of the plays, not plot, not language, emotion. Pay attention to how often Shakespeare explores identity under surveillance. Characters aware of how they're seen, careful with speech, navigating societies where appearance determines fate. That recurring emotional tension mirrors real experiences of marginalized identity, not exclusively, but recognizably, which is why modern scholars across different disciplines, literary, historical, post-colonial, keep circling the same quiet possibility. Maybe Shakespeare understood outsider psychology not only through imagination, but proximity. Again, pause. This is not final proof. History rarely offers dramatic single documents that solve centuries-old mysteries. Instead, truth emerges slowly, through accumulation, patterns aligning, contradictions refusing to disappear, questions growing stronger with each generation instead of fading. And Shakespeare's mystery has never faded. It has only grown more persistent. Now consider something even more revealing. If definitive proof had existed confirming a perfectly simple biography, clear education, clear travels, clear authorship, clear identity, this debate would have ended centuries ago. It didn't, because ambiguity survived, and survival of ambiguity is sometimes the strongest evidence that something complicated once existed. Which brings us to the psychological turning point of the story. The question is no longer, was Shakespeare black? The deeper question is, why has this possibility remained emotionally explosive for so long? Because emotional resistance in history usually signals hidden significance. Nobody defends trivial details for centuries. They defend foundations. And Shakespeare is not just literature, he is foundation of language, of cultural prestige, of Western intellectual identity. So even a small shift in his story would ripple outward far beyond academia, into education, into culture, into how entire generations understand who shaped the modern world. And that's why this mystery persists. Not because it's easy, because it's important. Important enough that silence lasted centuries. But silence has limits. Every hidden question eventually reaches a generation willing to ask it out loud. And once spoken, it cannot fully disappear again. Which leads us to the next, most dangerous layer of this investigation. Not just whether Shakespeare's identity was altered, but whether evidence of that alteration still survives in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to connect the final pieces. This is where the story stops feeling abstract, because once you start talking about evidence hiding in plain sight, the conversation shifts from philosophy to confrontation. Not confrontation with people, confrontation with memory. And memory is powerful because it feels permanent, stable, trustworthy. But history shows us something uncomfortable. Memory is one of the easiest things in the world to reshape, especially across centuries. Paintings are restored, texts are republished, descriptions are translated. Meanings drift quietly until the past begins to look exactly how the present prefers it. And by the time anyone notices, the original version feels impossible to recover. So the real danger in the Shakespeare question isn't just whether something changed, it's whether the change became invisible. Because invisible change is the most effective kind. No resistance, no outrage, just gradual certainty replacing older complexity. Now return to portraits again. Not to prove identity, but to understand how images behave over time. Across European history, visual representation followed power. Figures were painted to reflect ideals, not always reality. Skin tones softened, features refined, imperfections removed, not conspiracy, convention. Artists painted what patrons wanted remembered. And when the patron was empire, memory became political. So if ambiguity once existed around Shakespeare's appearance, even slight ambiguity, later centuries had every incentive to resolve it cleanly. Cleaner images create cleaner heroes. Cleaner heroes create cleaner national myths. And myths, once stabilized, are defended like truth. Now step away from art and look at language preservation. Words from the 1500s do not carry the same meaning today. Terms like Moor, black, dark, tawny, shifted definitions across time, translation, and culture. What once described complexion or heritage could later be softened into metaphor or erased entirely. That linguistic drift matters, because if identity is hidden in vocabulary that later generations reinterpret, the evidence doesn't disappear. It just becomes unreadable to people taught a different meaning. And unreadable history is almost as effective as erased history. Now, connect portraits, language, and silence together. Ambiguous imagery, shifting vocabulary, missing personal records, expanding empire needing cultural purity, centuries of growing certainty instead of growing detail. That direction is hard to ignore, not proof, but pressure toward a conclusion someone once preferred. And when history consistently moves toward comfort, truth is often waiting at the opposite direction. This is why the Shakespeare mystery refuses to die, because unanswered questions normally fade with time, legends dissolve, rumors disappear, but this one doesn't. Generation after generation returns to the same tension. Something about the story feels incomplete. And incompleteness in history usually signals one of two things: lost evidence or avoided evidence. Both are dangerous because both invite rediscovery, and rediscovery is the one force no empire can permanently control. Now step into the psychological core of the issue. If Shakespeare's identity were ever proven to include African ancestry, Moorish lineage, or racial ambiguity later minimized, the discovery wouldn't simply add diversity to literature. It would expose a structural illusion. That Western greatness developed in isolation. That genius followed racial boundaries. That civilization moved in a single cultural direction. All illusions sustained not just by power, but by repetition. And repetition is fragile, because one confirmed contradiction can unravel centuries of certainty. That is why debates like this feel so intense, not because they're weak, because they're close to something strong, close to the realization that history is less fixed than we were taught. And once that realization spreads, questions multiply everywhere. Who else was reclassified? Who else was forgotten? Which other pure cultural icons carry hidden complexity beneath polished stories? Those questions don't destroy history, they deepen it. But depth requires honesty, and honesty threatens comfort, which is why hidden truths rarely emerge through institutions first. They emerge through persistence, through people willing to sit with uncertainty long enough for clarity to appear. And clarity, when it finally arrives, usually feels obvious in hindsight, as if the evidence was always there, just waiting for permission to be seen. So now we stand closer than ever to the heart of the mystery, not chasing rumors, not chasing emotion. Following a trail of pressure leading somewhere, history tried not to look, and the closer that trail gets to resolution, the more urgent one final question becomes. The question quietly echoing behind every portrait, every missing document, every softened description across centuries. If the truth about Shakespeare's identity was once visible enough to be hidden, what might finally happen when the world is ready to see it again? By now, the mystery isn't just historical, it's psychological. Because the deeper you move into this question, the clearer something becomes. The real battlefield isn't the 1500s, it's the present. What we're really confronting is not Shakespeare's life, but our need for certainty about the past. Certainty feels safe, organized, stable. But history, when examined closely, is almost never stable. It shifts, reveals, contradicts itself in quiet ways. And the Shakespeare story contains one contradiction that refuses to disappear: too much influence with too little trace. The greatest writer in English history should leave overwhelming personal evidence, letters, diaries, detailed contemporary descriptions, clear educational records, obvious intellectual mentors. Instead, we have fragments, hints, legal paperwork, and centuries of interpretation trying to fill the silence. That imbalance alone keeps scholars uneasy, not because it proves anything dramatic, because it keeps the door open, and open doors in history are dangerous. They invite re-examination. Now step back and ask a harder question. Why does this possibility, even the possibility of Shakespeare having African or Moorish ancestry, feel so disruptive to people? because disruption reveals attachment, and attachment reveals importance. Shakespeare is not just literature, he is a symbol of cultural origin, the place where English identity tells the world, this is our genius, this is our foundation, this is where greatness begins. So when that symbol becomes uncertain, the emotional reaction is immediate, not always angry, sometimes dismissive, sometimes mocking, sometimes politely academic, but always protective, because people protect what they feel defines them, and civilizations do the same. Now consider something even more revealing. Throughout history, whenever marginalized groups begin reclaiming erased narratives, the first response is rarely investigation. It's disbelief, not because the idea is impossible, but because accepting it would force a painful recalibration of identity. We've seen this pattern repeatedly. Ancient African achievements dismissed for centuries. Black inventors credited elsewhere. Cultural contributions absorbed into dominant narratives until origin becomes invisible. Each time, the cycle repeats. Dismissal, ridicule, slow research, reluctant acceptance, sometimes generations later, which raises a quiet but serious possibility. What if the Shakespeare question is simply earlier in that same cycle? Not proven yet, not resolved yet, just not finished. History is full of ideas once mocked that later became undeniable, and the only consistent difference between ridicule and recognition is time. Time allows archives to open, language to be reinterpreted, evidence to be reconsidered by people less invested in protecting the old story. That shift is happening now across many fields: art history, archaeology, literary studies, genetic research, global historiography. Old assumptions are being tested with new tools and new perspectives, not to rewrite truth, but to find it more honestly. And honesty often reveals complexity where simplicity once ruled. So where does that leave Shakespeare? Not solved, not dismissed. Suspended in a space historians rarely like to admit: uncertainty with consequences, because the stakes are enormous. If nothing changes, the traditional story remains intact. But if new evidence ever confirms racial ambiguity, African ancestry, or deliberate image alteration, the impact would ripple across culture instantly. Education would shift. Literary history would expand. The story of Western genius would become shared, not diminished, shared. And sharing power has always been the hardest transition in history, which explains why this question feels so charged even without final proof. Because the conversation itself is already changing perspective, already forcing people to look closer at archives, closer at language, closer at the quiet spaces where truth often hides. And once people begin looking closely, history never feels simple again. That's the real turning point. Not a document, not a portrait, not a single discovery, but a change in awareness. Awareness that the past may be more connected, more complex, more human than the stories we inherited. And awareness cannot be undone. Once seen, it stays. Which brings us to the edge of the final question. Not just about Shakespeare, but about history itself. Because if one of the most protected cultural figures in the world can exist inside uncertainty for centuries, then certainty anywhere else becomes harder to trust. And when certainty weakens, curiosity grows. And curiosity is where truth begins. So the mystery is no longer just, was Shakespeare black? The deeper mystery now is this: if the world ever discovers that its greatest literary symbol was more culturally intertwined than history admitted, what other hidden connections between Africa, Europe, and the foundations of civilization are still waiting quietly for their moment to be seen